All right, Mark. I'm going to
Hello.
send you some pictures right
I
now.
fucking love it when you do this.
All right. So I'm going to say that again. Just no, it's fine. I'll just edit it out.
Ooh,
All right. So
yikes.
you should have received those pictures right now.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
want
They're
you to
not.
describe what you see in those photos.
So I'm looking at these photographs right now, Corrigan, and I'm seeing a scene, two scenes, in fact, of chaos and mayhem.
Yes.
So we are monochrome pictures, black and white pictures, some very oldie-timey automobiles.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take a very wild stab in the dark here and say that maybe we're in the 1920s, 1930s.
Very close, very close. Early, like 1910s. But yeah,
Okay,
right on the cusp.
But yeah, black and white photographs of devastation of what looks to be, a kind of a town and urban area, or maybe even a station, and it has been leveled to the ground. Collapsed buildings, rubble, debris. Young men picking through this debris, maybe looking for survivors or looking for what could have possibly caused this destruction. People in smartly dressed people I see in the second photograph, long coats and hats. This would appear to be an area of some money, some affluence.
Interesting.
But what I'm seeing is fucking old-timey chaos and mayhem and disaster.
Absolutely. Perfect descriptions. I knew you'd come through on describing what's happening here. And if you had to hazard to guess, what would you say happened in this neighborhood?
To me, there has been an earthquake or hurricane or a typhoon or some kind of natural weather event which has leveled the fuck out of this area.
Okay, well, Mark, it is not a natural event.
God damn.
That leveled this area.
My second guess was Mothra.
Closer, to be fair. These photos are from Boston, Massachusetts in 1919. And the destructive force that led to these sites was a massive wave of molasses unleashed on the city's north end.
That was my next guess. That was literally my next guess.
This wave killed 21 and injured 150 people. So
Holy
all
shit.
That devastation you're seeing in those photos that look like the outcome of the worst kinds of natural disasters, molasses did it.
Fucking hell. You can't spell molasses without spelling ass.
It's a really good point.
Think on.
Yeah, I'll just marinate on that while I tell you this story. So Boston Harbor was an incredibly important commercial site in the early 20th century and had been pretty much since this country and Boston was founded, which is why so much of the American Revolution is centered there. Important events like the Boston Tea Party and things like that. So trade between America and Europe used Boston as a hub, and thus the area was very densely packed with both businesses and residences. And the North End in particular was home predominantly to Italian immigrants. And actually, while it's pretty heavily commercialized and touristy at this point, to this day, it's still considered the sort of vibrant Italian-American center of that city. So at that point in time, though, we're talking immediately post-World War I, and the distrust of all marginally darker Catholic immigrants in the US, paired with anxiety about Italian anarchist sabotage, meant that Italians weren't treated with a whole lot of respect and were instead met with a great deal of hostility and suspicion in America.
Back up. Italian,
sure.
Anarcho.
Just anarchists.
Italian anarchists.
Italian anarchists were a fear, and one that was indeed somewhat founded, actually, in that during the war, there had been sort of Italian anarchists who had come through and targeted or sort of spied on various areas around Boston Harbor as a spot for potential sabotage.
Huh.
Yeah, so it wasn't completely unfounded, but also, of course,
that felt arbitrary. All those Italians.
No, it was absolutely in some ways connected to the events that were going on, but also is very much connected to the impending Red Scare and general fears of communism and anarchy and every other form of government or lack thereof that Americans were terrified of at that point, any form of system that they were afraid these outside invaders were going to bring in. So overblown fear, absolutely, at this point. And by the way, people being mean to Italians is how we got stuck worshiping Christopher Columbus over here for the past century and a half. So, be careful who you bully, or they might make a folk hero out of a genocidal maniac, I guess. But anyways, at this point, Italians are being treated pretty shitty in America, and that'll come back around again. But anyway, we find ourselves in the North End, this Italian section of Boston, on January 15th, 1919, in the shadow of a tank holding some 2.3 million gallons of molasses.
Can I just make sure that I know what molasses is?
Oh, yeah.
I'm pretty sure I do, but just in case, it's like a very syrupy, thick kind of treacle kind of substance, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Is that not like a common thing?
No, it is completely. I just wanted to be sure that it is what I thought it was.
Okay, yes, that's exactly what it is. And it is important to know that. And the molasses came in on ships from the Caribbean, and it would be transported to a distillery nearby to be used in the making of rum.
Rum, yes.
Yes, yeah, one of the big uses of molasses. This tank, however, was absolutely built for a good time and not a long time. And it started showing weaknesses pretty much from the moment they started heaping the molasses into it. People nearby would report that the tank would, quote, shudder and groan when filled. There were visible leaks from its sides from which local children would bring pails to fill up and take home. These were obvious hazards, but being the 1910s, when the owners of the tank at U.S. Industrial Alcohol were alerted to these issues by their workers, they decided it would be too costly to fix it. So, and I'm not bullshitting you here when I say this, they painted the tank brown so the leaks wouldn't stand out as much instead of fixing.
Big brain time.
Right, that's some galaxy brain shit right there. One worker brought actual shards of steel that had broken off the tank into the treasurer's office to show the danger. And the treasurer responded, "I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands."
Yeah. What do you want from me, yeah?
It hasn't fallen over yet, so...
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. So engineer Ronald Mayville has studied the flood and surmises that the tank was probably built with the specifications you would use to hold water.
I see.
But molasses is a whole lot heavier than water is. A
heavy, viscous fluid.
Exactly. Further, the rivet design on the tank was flawed, which elevated the danger even more. Neither of these mistakes were based on ignorance. They knew better. They knew how to build a tank better than this at the time. They had the engineering skill. So this isn't simply a matter of like, oh, people back then didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
They could have made a better tank.
Which is in many, all kind of large scale loss of life and disaster like this are terrible, absolutely terrible. And you see this time and time again, even in modern tellings, modern events, modern disasters, people who fucking knew that what they were doing was going to end in tragedy and just either crossing their fingers or weighing up the beam counters, weighing up the columns. The cost will be outweighed by the payout.
That's exactly it. That's 100% what happened here, that they wagered that the cost to fix it would be much worse than the cost to mitigate whatever disaster happened afterwards. And I'm sure they had no idea this was the kind of disaster that would happen. The tank had been built quickly in the winter of 1915 to meet rising demand for industrial alcohol, which could be distilled from molasses and sold to weapons companies who used it to make dynamite and other explosives for use during World War I. So this was supposed to be like kind of a temporary thing, right? They're like, okay, we need a place to store this before we use this.
So molasses was also a component, or at least unrefined component of explosives. Wow.
Yeah. Who knew? I had no idea before reading up on this. Yeah. And so that was what this tank was built for. Basically just sort of put the molasses in it, then we can use it, extract what we need to make the weapons, and that's it. It was not meant to be used long-term as a storage solution, which after the war ended, they continued its use. So around lunchtime, On that day in January, the tank finally gave out, and that 2 million gallons of molasses was released in a wave 15 feet high and
Oh my God.
160 feet wide, traveling at a speed of 35 miles per hour.
A tsunami of molasses.
In fact, that term will be used as I explain this further.
Yeah.
So as any wave of that size would be, especially in the middle of a city where there should not be a wave of any kind.
Yeah, sure. Cities aren't built with molasses tsunamis in mind.
Yeah, or any kind of tsunami, yes, they were on the water, but it's not like the ocean. It's, it wasn't, you don't get waves in the middle of Boston like that. So certainly not built for that kind of damage, especially made of molasses. So it was massively destructive outright. It lifted houses off their foundations and slammed them against other buildings. Buildings collapsed, as did the elevated rail that brought trains through town. It swept up people, horses, and cars. And
I'm looking again at the pictures.
Yeah, right. And
it cannot be overstated just how big a number this fucking... wow.
It really, if you compare that to photos from like the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco or things you're looking at the same kinds of destruction here. But that was the first part of destruction. So fluid dynamics expert Dr. Nicole Sharp explains that there were basically two stages of this deadly molasses flood. The first, she calls the tsunami. So she explains that molasses is 1.5 times heavier than water. It's very dense. The tank piled so high with molasses stored a large amount of potential energy. So when the tank ruptured, all that potential energy became kinetic energy.
Yep.
So the fact that molasses is extremely viscous doesn't matter for the first 60 to 90 seconds. The inertia is so much more powerful than the forces that can be moved by the viscosity. In other words, generally, molasses is super slow moving. That's why there's that phrase, slow as molasses, right?
Are we saying it picks up speed? Are we saying it picks up pace when it gets moving?
No, the opposite of that. Because there was so much built up energy in there, that potential energy, it immediately came out in a rush when that
right.
became the kinetic energy. So the first 60 to 90 seconds or 30 to 60 seconds, I just hit my elbow. Oh, sorry, I need a second. I hit it really bad.
Oh man, how have you done this? I bet you wish it was alcoholic whiskey now.
Oh god damn. Okay. Hurt a lot. It's so sharp. It's so sharp.
I can see tears in your eyes even from here.
Yeah. Oh, that is the worst kind of. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Then my dog just jumped off the chair. Okay. So, talking about that. So molasses generally very slow moving. So when it burst through those walls, that first 60 to 90 seconds was when it was at its most powerful before its own viscosity caught up with it. So when that wave hit, quote, people's bones were crushed, their bodies thrown onto buildings and train cars. Many survivors had broken backs and fractured skulls. So when we talk about 150 injured in this, we're not talking about people getting up and walking away a little sticky. These are life-altering injuries, of course, that people sustained here. And then you get the second phase, in which the inertia runs out and the molasses slows, presenting an entirely different problem. It's now thick and sticky. So people who are trapped in it not only had difficulty moving, if they swallowed it, they'd then be sort of choking on molasses.
Oh God, nothing sounds more fucking horrifically an horrific way to die than drowning in molasses.
Yes, and drowning in molasses is drowning in water cranked to 11. It's pressing down on your chest and your lungs. It's pushing you up against things like buildings, and if you swallow it, you can't just spit it out. It suffocates you. So that it was January only made it worse, as the cold air made the molasses even thicker and harder to move. The majority of the people that died in the molasses flood died from asphyxiation. An absolutely horrendous way to go. So now, circling back to the fact that this is the north end of Boston at a time of great suspicion of Italian immigrants, the defense attorney for USIA, Charles Choate, tried to blame Italian anarchists for what had happened. It must have been sabotage from those Italians, since there was that deep paranoia about anarchist activity in the area among white Bostonians. At this point, Italians were not considered white. Choate figured he could use it to shift the suspicions away from the company's obvious negligence.
Mm-hmm.
And this was also an era in which the bosses generally got away with this shit. The Supreme Court was pushing for lax regulation of industry that made it so that companies avoided liability in court when terrible stuff that was clearly their fault happened. The Molasses Flood proved to be something of a turning point, though. Colonel Hugh Ogden was appointed as the auditor of the case in the Massachusetts Superior Court, and Ogden was big into justice. Didn't like anarchists or anything they stood for, things like that, but he saw what happened and he knew this wasn't about this. And he found the company fully responsible and ordered a payout of $7 million, which is equivalent in today's money to about $111 million.
Okay.
This was not normal at that point. This did not happen with these things. And so this ended up setting a precedent that negligence on the part of companies was not to be glossed over, and that workers and others affected by things like this had the legal right to compensation for the tragic consequences.
Big turning point.
Big, huge turning point in America. So while it's an enormous tragedy, the outcome of it cannot be overstated for what it did for our labor in this country. And
I don't know a lot about American history, but this feels like it should be maybe more well known. Is this a big? Do you learn about this in school?
No, absolutely not. It's wild. It's an interesting story first and foremost. It's terrible, and keep in mind, I grew up in Massachusetts, so you would think at least I would have heard of it growing up. But then also to have such a distinct impact on labor, probably more so than something like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that we learn a lot about and hear a ton about, which was terrible, a much bigger loss of life, and lots of that we absolutely should learn about that. But in terms of like a distinct turning point in, movements towards holding corporations, companies accountable for stuff, this made huge waves, and for some reason we don't hear about it.
But as is so often the case, when change happens, it's often as a result of tragedy. It often comes hot on the heels of something fucking appalling happening to act as the harbinger of that change.
Yeah, and this is definitely just such a case.
What do you think the first person who saw the molasses tsunami coming their way shouted? What do you fucking shout?
At least amongst the first people was actually a police officer. And his name, I feel like his name is actually the name of one of the characters from The Departed, but I can't think of what it is right now. But he had literally like just finished ringing into the station about something else when he was hit in the back by the wave. He was about 100 feet from the molasses, and he somehow managed to sort of call out that they needed to get as much backup. He managed to tell I think whatever kind of phone or whatever he was using, he managed to get forth to them, bring as many backup as possible. Something terrible is happening. So
amazing that you know this. You're the best fucking researcher around.
I read a lot of articles and these things. Everyone go and look at the blog and see all the links every week, that go into these opens. But it's interesting. The things that people talked about in it happening was like, you almost expect the sound of like an explosion or something like that, but it was really just sort of this rumble. And then there it was. And there was no getting away from it. Like if you saw it happen, if you heard it happen, it was on you faster than you could possibly get out of that way.
And I would even imagine that even after the calamity itself, you'd then have scavengers, you'd have rats, you'd have birds, you'd have corpses stuck in molasses for fucking months.
And it was hard for them to get like the bodies out and stuff because of the fact that like the rescuers would sink in it, so they had to do things like like when we talked about the quicksand thing in Birmingham. where they put ladders across it so that they could, sort of set it on and not sink into the molasses as they were trying to get people. And because, again, it was so cold and the molasses kind of hardened, it was like a whole other obstacle to pulling rubble apart to get bodies and stuff like that out of it.
Incredible.
Yeah. Wild stuff.
Incredible. And something else to fucking put in my list of stuff I now know. Thanks and only thanks to Jack of all Graves.
Indeed.